Nice and beautiful wild brown there. Got a nice little barbless hook right out of there. Gorgeous fish. Life is good. Well, it's another fun fishing experience. Gorgeous fall day like this, boy, it doesn't get any better than that. You know, I'm Phil Gay. I've been a fly fisherman all my life, and over the years I've learned a couple of important things. One, you need to be a good caster, but more importantly, you need to be able to present the fly properly to the fish. This will increase your fish catching percentages dramatically. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some whole series of presentation casts to help you catch more fish. Let's take a look at the reach cast, which is the basic building block of presentation cast. The situation is that we have a fish sitting in slower water next to the bank, and we have to cross faster water to get to that fish. So we need to get the fly across the fast water, represented by the larger blue arrow, to the slower water that's over closer to the bank, and the bank is represented by the black boards. And then the gray ring there is a rising fish. We need to get our fly across the fast water into the slow water so that it can drift down to the rising fish. Done properly, the reach cast will end up with essentially a straight line from the fly back to the rod tip, just like that. We may have to do some additional small mends to keep the drift going. We want to land it just like I did there. It's just a couple, 2 or 3 feet above the fish, and let it drift right down to him. The important part of this cast is that the rod never stops moving. You can't stop it and then reach. You have to stop it coming forward and immediately start it left, just like that. That way you end up with a straight line from the fly back to the rod tip. I almost never make a cast without putting at least a little bit of a reach cast in it to go across fast water into slow, or sometimes even to just keep the leader a little bit off of a drift line if I'm just fishing straight upstream. Now let's take a look at the basic reach cast on the water. Situation here is that we got some fast moving water in front of me, and I got a little bit slower water over there, and I got to get under that limb as well. So I just lay it upstream. Might have to do a couple little kick mends like that. And you see it had a near perfect drift down through there. Best way to judge your drift is to take a look at your fly and take a look at the bubbles that are around it. If they're all moving at the same rate, you're probably getting a pretty good drift. That's all there is to the basic reach cast. Just put it across, bring the rod upstream, follow it back down with maybe a couple little kick mends. That's your basic reach cast. Now you can extend it over a little bit further like that. You can even reach it back right underneath the tree, but you're still doing the same basic cast. Now let's talk about a downstream cast. We don't fish downstream enough, or most people don't, and it's a very effective way to get the fly to the fish, especially fish that are in tight spots, like we've got a log over here, we've got a fish sitting right at the edge of a log. You can't fish to that fish from below, because the current's going down this way. Over here we have the bank and a rock, nice, easy, slow current down through here. We've got a fish sitting down here, but we've got a tree down below there, and we can't get to that fish from below. So we're going to approach both of these fish from above. Now, a couple considerations on downstream casts. Don't get yourself in exactly the same line as the fish you're trying to fish on, because the eddy disturbance coming off of you will disturb that fish, and he'll probably relocate. So always offset yourself a little bit from the where you're going to fish to. Same thing will happen over here. One other consideration when you're fishing downstream is after you complete your drift over the top of the fish, don't snatch the fly up right over the top of the fish. And I'll show you how we'll get the fly to get away from the fish so we can pick it up without disturbing it. Okay, the classic downstream cast, you make the cast, leave the rod up nice and high until the fly is on the water, and then you'll lower the rod, and then when you lower the rod, that's your initial slack to do the drift with. Looks like this. You don't want to land on the fish, obviously, so you hold your rod up nice and high, fly's on the water, and then you lower the rod, and this slack right here in front of you, that's going to be your initial drift time. And if you need more, you can do those kick mends like you've seen in other places in the video. So here's the classic downstream cast. Fly on the water, lower the rod, and that will drift right down to the fish. Now after it's drifted past the fish, we'll just put it past him. You didn't take it that time. What you don't want to do is snatch it right up over his head like that to make the next cast. So here it is down here. Get it below the fish. Put your rod out in either direction, whichever got the best current. If you put your rod out to either side, the current will then take your line, pull the fly away from the line of the fish, and then you can pick it up and do another cast. Another variation of a downstream cast is called a pile cast, where we throw a high trajectory cast and it kind of settles down and we get a lot of slack on the end of the line, and it looks like this. The slack's already in there and that will carry it right on down to the fish. You can see you got a nice bit of slack, above the fish, in the line, and that'll drift right down to the fish. So if you're having trouble doing the regular cast, then the pile cast or puddle cast will also suffice. Now let's take a look at a downstream reach cast, which is just a combination of the downstream and we throw a reach in at the same time. The reason you need to do that is that we have a fish here working off the point of this log. I can't get over here because if I stand directly in line with that fish and do a classic downstream cast, my eddy is going to disturb that fish. So I've got to stay over here, but I want the fly in the line to be directly in line with the current as it approaches that fish. So I make a classic downstream cast, rod up till the fly's on the water, and I just put a reach in at the same time, and then I lower my rod, and there's my drift time right here. You want to get your fly right in line with the fish, lower the rod. Get that fly right in line with the fish, lower the rod. Here's our drift time, here's our slack, and you can see that the line and the fly are lined up directly to feed into that fish. Now let's take a look at both of these casts on the water, the downstream cast and the downstream reach cast. All right, now we're in the river. We're going to take a look at these casts, downstream casts over here to this fish that's rising just slightly below that rock. We have another fish working over here just ahead of that log over there. Now, I mentioned earlier that you don't want to stand directly above your fish because the disturbance from the water coming past me will disturb that fish and he may move. Another thing to consider when you're working downstream is you got to give the fish a little bit more room, because remember, he's looking upstream at you. So you probably have to give him another 8 or 10 feet than you might have to if you were working from below the fish. We'll first take a look at the downstream cast. And remember, this cast, the very important thing here is to keep the rod up until the fly is on the water. Rod is up, fly's on the water. Then we lower the rod, and that allows everything to feed right down to the fish. So if we have a fish working somewhere down just to the right of that rock down there somewhere, you don't want to cast right directly to him. Rod up, flies on the water, lower the rod, let the fly feed right down. If you need longer drift time, you can start doing your little kick mends, and it will just continue to feed right down there, just a near perfect drift right down the center of the run there. Now, if it's gone past the fish, you don't want to snatch your line directly up over the top of them. All you have to do is set your rod off to the side like this. The current then will carry the line over to the left. Once the fly has cleared the lane that the fish is sitting on, about like that, then you can slide it up out of there and make another presentation. Remember, rod up, fly on the water, lower the rod, let it feed down to the fish. If you need additional drift time, kick mend, kick mend, kick mend, sometimes called stacking mends. Kick, kick, kick. We could drift all the way down to the end of the pool doing that if you wanted to. Let the fly clear the fish, pick it back up, make another presentation. Fly up, fly on the water, rod up, lower the rod, and that's your drift time right there. Lip, kick, then you can start doing additional kick mends if you need to. Now let's take a look at the downstream reach cast, which is simply a downstream cast combined with a reach cast. And the reason we need to do that here is that I can't stand directly above this fish or I'm going to disturb him. So but I do need to get my line aligned with where the fish is rising. He's coming up right toward the end of that log. So I need to do a downstream cast, which you just saw, but I need to combine that with a little reach cast. So here's my downstream, and I reach everything over to the left. Now my line is perfectly aligned with the drift that the fish is on. And once again, I continue to do some kick mends, little stacking mends, let it drift right down past the end of a log. Okay, the fly's now cleared the fish. We can pick it up. Downstream reach, lower the rod, do your little kick mends, and when you're doing those mends, keep flipping the line over so it's aligned directly, so all the line is aligned. That fly's going right by the end of the log there now, and that guy's asleep, he doesn't want to take it, okay? All right, once it's cleared the fish, pick it up, downstream reach, everything's in line, start doing my little kick mends, keep everything in alignment as it's going down the river. Now let's take a look at that pile cast on the water. Now let's take a look at another cast I call a circle cast. It's sort of a variation of a reach cast with a distinct difference that the circle cast is a decelerating cast, whereas a reach cast is a normal accelerating cast. The situation on the river is the same, nearly the same. We have fast water, and we're going to have to cross that to get the slower water right next to the bank or a log, which is this is. And this circle here represents a rising fish who's up nice and tight to the bank. As we all know, that's exactly what they like to do. They get as tight to the bank as they can, and we have to cross this fast water to get to it. One of the advantages of the circle cast is that it will allow us to fish to that fish or to this fish without ever changing the length of line that I'm working with. So here I am standing looking at this riffle here, and I've got rising fish over there, and of course the nicest fish is over there against the bank. Now remember, it's a decelerating cast, which is very abnormal. The rod slows down as we come ahead. The rod is slowing down as opposed to accelerating like our normal cast. The other thing that's distinct about the circle cast is that the rod actually starts curving downstream first, and then is brought around, and it always ends up like this. Remember the reach cast, we probably ended up with the rod down here. In the circle cast, the rod ends up, because at the completion of the cast, when you lower the rod, this is your drift line right here in front of you. So here's what it looks like in real time. We want to go right tight to the bank here, circle it downstream and up, drop the rod. Circle it downstream and up, drop the rod. The advantage of a circle cast is that you can place the fly much more accurately to the bank than you can with a reach cast. You can lay it right on the very edge of the river, just like that. Right on the very edge of the river. And you can kind of pick up your fly as it comes around, and when you want the fly to stop, you just stop moving the rod. Now, if I'm working on this fish, and this guy here decides to come up, so I've already got that length already gauged for that fish. If I just bring the rod around in a tighter circle like that, I can drop it right in front of this fish. The only difference what I did was I brought the rod around tighter to me like that. And you see how high it is right here. And as the current starts to take the fly, I just start lowering the rod and it feeds it right down to that fish. So I can either go back to that fish, never change the length of line, right to this guy right here. Back to him. Bring the circle around a little tighter above my head. See where the rod, how high the rod is, and I just lower it and drift it right down to that fish. And you can work about a 20 or 30 foot section of river across from you with the same length line. Now let's take a look at the circle cast on the water. The situation here is that we've got fast water here. We have a log across the way there, and we have fish rising along the log. And I've also seen one rising in a little closer to us here. The important thing on this circle cast, remember it's a decelerating cast, unlike the normal accelerating cast. Another important thing on the circle cast is it needs to be worked either directly across or slightly downstream from you. You cannot work this cast upstream of you. So always work, get yourself positioned above the fish you're trying to fish to so you can circle the cast around and drop it right on their head. Now let's take a look at this cast. I'll go all the way over to the log, keep the rod high, and then lower the line right into the drift. All right, we've been working on this fish over against the log, and I noticed that somebody else came up right next to me here, right just past this rock. So I won't even change the length of the line. I'll just come around a little bit tighter to me, put it right down next to that rock, drift down over that fish. There he is, right there. All right. You thought I was fishing to that guy over there, didn't you? Sometimes life just works out. Yeah, nice little brownie there. Goodbye. Well, you'll never get a better example of why the circle cast is such a nice cast. I was fishing to that fish over there. This guy rose, never changed the length of my line, just brought the circle around a little tighter over my head, drifted right down on that fish and picked him up on the first cast. Now let's look at some casts that will get us some slack when we're fishing upstream. The first of those is the check cast. The second one is a sort of a variation of a check cast called a bounce back cast. And the last one is called a wiggle cast. Let's do the check cast first. The check cast, you really do need the term comes from checking up the rod. And as the rod comes forward, we actually stop the rod, pull it back slightly, and then immediately push the rod down. And you should be shooting line at the same time. And you'll just throw a lot of slack right out at the end of the fly line. Let's take a look at that one first. You can see we threw an enormous amount of slack right out there at the end of the fly line. There's also some of that in the leader. We check the rod up and then we stuff the rod all in one nice smooth motion. In real time, it looks just like this. You see we threw a whole pile of slack right out at the end of the fly line, and you can see how quickly the river's straightening out that line, and the fly is just now getting a good drift all the way down through there. I want you to observe that one more time. Look how quickly the river is going to straighten out that fly line. Meanwhile, we're getting a good drift out where the fly is. Okay. So that's the check cast. The very effective cast can be used both upstream and downstream. It's often used better upstream when you're fishing straight up like this, or even across. Now let's do the bounce back cast. This is essentially an overpowered cast that you do not shoot line on, and you will literally allow the line to reach the end of its travel and bounce back toward you. And it looks like this. Overpowered, using more power in the cast than we need, and we let it bounce back. And it throws a little bit of slack in the line. It's not near as effective as a check cast, but it is a way to get some slack in the line. You see we've got slack, but you notice the slack ends up more back toward you and less out toward the fly, and that's really where you want the slack. You want the slack out at the end of the cast. One more time on the bounce back, overpowered cast, boom, let it bounce back. You see that most of the slack is actually down in here, not out to where the fly is. Now let's take a look at the wiggle cast. A lot of times riffles are very deceiving. They look like the flow is all homogeneous and it's all the same speed, and in reality there's a lot of little micro currents in there. So the wiggle cast just allows you to put a bunch of slack in the line, all throughout the line, and it will improve the quality of your drift. So the wiggle cast is essentially done as the cast is going out. You just literally wiggle the rod tip back and forth like that, and it will put a series of little S turns in your line. So it looks like this. Boom, wiggle, wiggle, wiggle back and forth. You can see we threw a bunch of big S curves in the line here. Once again, as the line's going out, wiggle, 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 whole series of little S turns in the line. It's a pretty effective cast, really. It'll help you out in a lot of situations where you're fishing directly upstream into a riffle. Once again, wiggle, 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 boom. Nice little bunch of series of S curves all throughout your line. Now let's take a look at combining a couple of the casts we've learned. Remember, we learned a reach cast. We also learned a check cast. So let's look at combining a reach and a check. And sometimes we need the slack that the check cast gives us, but it's helpful to also get your line aligned with the flow. So combining a reach and a check makes a lot of sense at times. So let's take a look at it. It's simply the reach cast and the check cast combined. Now here it is, check and reach, check and reach, and we can also do them the other way, check and reach to the right. Now let's look at a cast that will allow us to get the nymph down quickly when we're casting upstream, we're nymphing upstream. And it's called a tuck cast. The whole idea there is to get that nymph to tuck around, and if at all possible, land actually below the end of the fly line, or at least the end of part of the leader. So you have to stop the rod very crisply and let the nymph tuck around. Remember, the nymphs are normally weighted. If we're fishing straight upstream into a run, the current's coming right at us, we have some fish somewhere, we suspect we have some fish, or maybe we can even see them up in there. We're going to try to land the fly, obviously, above the fish, and have it get down very quickly to where that fish is. So the tuck cast is basically a crisply stopped cast, the fly tucks down and sinks very quickly because we actually bang that fly down. Bang. And you can see in that case the end of the line is even with where the nymph is. That puts a lot of slack out there, allows that nymph to sink very quickly. Here it is again. And see, in this case, the end of the fly line is actually out beyond where the nymph hit the water. And that's is the best you can do with the tuck cast. Ideally, it should work out every way that time, but it doesn't always. All right, now let's take a look at the tuck cast on the water. Remember, the important thing here is to try to get your nymph, or in this case we're using an egg pattern so you can see it, to come into the water downstream of your strike indicator. Remember, we're casting upstream here. You want this egg to pivot around and land below your strike indicator. And you do that by executing a high angle cast. Hold the rod high, a little extra power so that everything can kind of pivot around. Let's take a look at it. You can see the egg landed completely below the strike indicator. The entire length of the leader below the egg, that's how far the nymph is landing downstream. You see how high the rod is stopping here. The rod stops very high, a little overpowered, and your nymph will tuck underneath the strike indicator or your leader if you're not using a strike indicator. And that's why we call it a tuck cast, because it does in fact tuck under. The tuck cast is a very important nymphing cast, especially if you're working upstream. Because if you just cast your nymphs upstream, it's very difficult for the nymph itself to get down unless you have an excessive amount of weight on it. But if you can get your nymphs to come in below the strike indicator, they'll get down very quickly. Now here's a little variation on this cast. This is the tuck cast, and we're going to add a reach to it so that I get all my line over in this moving water over here. Tuck and reach. Now all my line is over here in that flow line. All we're doing is combining the basic tuck cast and adding a reach cast on top of it, just like that. We're going to do a reach tuck this time, but we're going to be reaching to the right because we want to get our line aligned in this flow line over here. So tuck, and we'll reach right in this case. Again, reach tuck to the right. Now let's look at a cast that allows you to deal with special situations when we're going cross river. We'll call this a bump cast. We're putting a bump mend in the line in a place where we need it to be. Now in this particular case out here, what we have is we've got the river going left to right, represented by the big arrows. We have a big rock in the middle of the river, and as you know, behind a big rock like that, you're always going to get a little backflow up toward the rock. A classic piece of pocket water. Now if we want to fish on the other side of that rock, we have to deal with this backwater that's going up toward the rock behind it. So we have to put a bump mend downstream. And you execute a bump mend by simply pushing the rod out and back. Now the trick with this cast is to get it to where you want it to be. And it's going to take some practice. So we go, here's the cast, boom. Come up a little bit short on that one, so we'll do it again, boom. And there's our nice little bumper line downstream that the river is going to push upstream while we're getting a good drift out there. So here's the whole cast in sequence, boom. Nice little bumper line downstream in the pocket, and while the river deals with that and pushes it upstream, we're getting a good drift out there. All right, now let's take a look at the bump cast on the river. And the situation here is that we're trying to cast over to that bank. Between us and the bank, we've got a big rock here that's forming this pocket. And if we just cast straight across it, you see immediately the line is being caught up in the pocket and the fly is being dragged. So what we need to do is we need to put a bump in the other direction so that the river has something to work with there. So it looks like this. And we put a bump downstream, and while the river's working on that, we get a good drift over on the other end. It's very difficult to learn to judge these, but after you practice them a little bit, you can get that bump right where you want it. To execute this cast, all you do is push the rod out to the right and back. It's called a bump. You bump it out to the right and back, and it puts a little loop in your line. Basically, the line followed what the rod tip did, and when the rod went out and back, the line went out and back. But it takes a little while to learn to judge them. Once you practice it, work with it on the grass a little bit, you can put that bump wherever you want it. For instance, if the rock was further out, you'd bump right away, and you can see that bump is way out that way. If the rock was closer into you and your problem was in here, you delay your bump, and then you can bring that bump right in close to you. So you just have to learn to judge the timing of your bump to get the bump into the right spot. We've got our bump mend in there. We're going to get a good drift for only about 10 feet or so. Once that pocket starts to grab the line like that, there isn't much else you can do. You can try a downstream mend. Might extend the drift a little bit. We reach her out there, bump it around, and that's the bump cast. We need to talk about one other technique for nymphing, and it's called high stick nymphing, where we keep the minimum amount of line on the water and keep our rod out and up to minimize the drag on the strike indicator or on the nymphs. This little run here has got some very fast water, and what we need to do is we need to position ourselves so that we can reach our rod across this fast water to fish the slower water in between, because that's where the fish are going to be. Let's go give it a try. Okay, I'm just going to kind of banging the nymphs down. I'm holding everything up nice and high. And I'm basically following the strike indicator downstream with the rod tip. Putting the rod tip right over top of the strike indicator. And when it stops like that, I give it a quick pop. We don't know if that's a fish or it's a bottom, but we got to give it a little quick pop there. Bang it down, throw a little mend in, lift it up. hold that rod tip way out and across. Boom. It's much more important here that the rod tip be out than up. You want to extend your arm as far as you can. Get that rod tip out that way as far as you can. Now, if that strike indicator stops, you got to give that a quick pop. Don't get a little. Some people start lifting to see if there's anything there, and that's a bad mistake, because as soon as the fish feels the pressure, he's going to let go of it. So, if you feel that thing, if you see that thing stop, you set the hook. Which means you give it a good firm pop. Hook sets are free. You can have as many as you want. That one felt like it might have been a fish there. Now let's look at a curve cast. The curve cast allows you to get the fly close to the bank with the fly below the leader and the line. Now, there's a situation here where we've got fast water, slow water closer to the bank, fish down in here, and we have to fish it from directly across from it. So we need to be able to get the fly around like this so that the fly basically parallels the bank, as close into the bank as you can, so it can drift down to this fish that's feeding in close to the bank. This curve cast is a powered curve cast. We're going to do it at a low angle, which makes it easier, and we'll make a very abrupt stop, and the fly will kick around and parallel the bank, just like it did right there. So you can see the fly, and then the leader is nearly parallel to the bank. Do that again. Very hard stop. The fly is just almost in front of the fish, and the leader is parallel to the bank, and then this part of the upper part of the line is also parallel to the bank. So that's the powered curve cast to the left, just like that. Another way to think about this cast, it's simply a horizontal tuck cast. It can be done with a dry fly, can also be done with a nymph. It's a very good way to nymph the edges of the river when you're committed to fish across to the bank. Now let's look at a situation where the river's going in the other direction. We're still casting across fast water, slow, fish down here. This is going to be the curve cast to the right. The easiest way to do that is to get this rod across your body, get it over in here, and still snap it around like that. And you can see the leader ends up parallel to the bank with the fly feeding directly down to the fish. That rod just snap her around like that. See, the leader is perfectly parallel to the bank right there. And that's exactly what you want to see, and everything else will just feed on down. Just like that. Now let's take a look at a couple unpowered curve casts. Situations are the same, it's just another way to get the fly parallel to the bank. Sometimes this is easier for people than the powered curve, so let's take a look at that one. Simply what you're doing with the unpowered curve is that you're making a C with your rod, and it parallels the bank. The C sort of parallels the bank, and it looks like this. And the fly ends up, once again, the leader nearly parallel to the bank. A C with a rod, and we end up with a line and the leader parallel to the bank. Now let's look at a really clever little cast. I call it a downstream roll ahead. If you can master this one, you can be part of my team. This is it's a great little cast. The situation is you're trying to fish downstream, but you don't have any room to cast high behind you because we've got trees or some other obstruction back here. It also works very well when you're trying to cast into a headwind that's blowing directly upstream, whereas the downstream cast gets blown all over. This little downstream roll head will roll right along the water and lay out just nicely for you. There's two important things about this cast are that the whole cast takes place more behind you than a normal cast. So the rod's going to be more back in here than a normal cast. The second thing is there is no stop in the front. We actually just take the rod and roll it down like that. So that there's no stop, we just stop moving forward and start rolling the rod back. And we're going to continue this around. There's going to be essentially an oval here. And here's what it looks like in real time. It's real important to do that last little kick of that rod forward to put that slack right down there at the end of the line. Remember that rod tip is just going through an oval. We drop it down and we continue right on around and throw that line downstream like that. In real time, boom, boom. And it rolls right down there and just stacks up beautifully right at the end of the line. It's real important you do that final little kick of line downstream because that's your initial drift time. And then you can also continue, of course, to do additional kick mends. So we got our fish down here. We're going to do our little downstream roll head. We just roll that beautiful little pile of slack right down to the end of the line, and it just drifts right on down to the fish. Now let's take a look at this downstream roll ahead on the river here. Got a nice little run going down underneath the trees. I don't have a lot of room behind me. I'm going to do a nice little downstream roll ahead right here. Yeah, nice little brown. Thank you, my friend. Well, a great fall day, nice little fish. Time to call it a day. We learned a lot in this video about presentations. Get out there and practice those and get out there and enjoy your fishing like I do. Take care.